There's a story that almost nobody tells properly. It's not about a crash. It's not about a pilot error. It's not about bad weather or mechanical failure. It's about something far more disturbing. An airline that fought wars, survived disasters, outlasted rivals, and built something genuinely great, and then lost everything. Not to the sky, to a boardroom. And here's the detail that will stay with you. On the 21st of December 1988, a bomb ripped through a Boeing 747 above a quiet Scottish town called Lockerbie. 270 people died. The worst terrorist attack in British history. The wreckage fell on Scotland, on the very land that gave birth to this airline's identity. But the airline called British Caledonian, the one that carried Scotland's name across the world, was already gone by then. Absorbed, dissolved, erased from the register 8 months before that bomb went off. It survived Lockerbie because it didn't exist anymore to be destroyed by it. Think about that for a moment. This is the story of British Caledonian, known to everyone who flew in the 1970s and 80s as BCal. The airline with the tartan uniforms, the lion on the tail, and a slogan that hit different in an era of grey, state-owned aviation. We never forget you have a choice. They meant every word of it, and it cost them everything. To understand why BCal mattered, you have to understand what British aviation looked like before it existed. Because in the 1960s, flying in Britain meant one thing: the government. British European Airways handled domestic and short-haul routes. The British Overseas Airways Corporation, BOAC, handled the long-haul world. Two enormous taxpayer-backed colossi that between them controlled almost every seat on every meaningful route out of this country. Independent airlines existed, yes, but they were small. Charter work, mostly. Seasonal, marginal. Nobody seriously challenged the big two. Adam Thompson didn't come from money. He didn't come from connections. He came from Glasgow, served in the Fleet Air Arm during his formative years, and developed an understanding of aviation that was practical, not theoretical. He wasn't building an empire for shareholders. He was building something he believed in. In April of 1961, Thompson co-founded Caledonian Airways, a small, wholly private charter airline that started with a single leased Douglas the 607C, 104 seats, and contracts that most established operators wouldn't touch. Within a decade, it was Britain's second largest independent airline. But Thompson wanted more than charter work. He wanted scheduled routes. He wanted to look a passenger in the eye and say, "We fly here, every week, reliably, and we do it better than the state carrier." The opportunity came in 1970, when the Edwards Committee's recommendations created the political conditions for a merger that would change everything. Caledonian Airways merged with British United Airways, BUA, the largest British independent airline at the time and the UK's leading independent scheduled carrier. The combined entity was officially formed on the 30th of November 1970. British Caledonian Airways was born. The government transferred route authorities that mattered, Central and West Africa, South America, from BOAC to BCal, giving the new airline a real foundation, not a charity, a platform, and Thompson used it. By 1980, BCal had acquired DC-10 wide-body aircraft and was operating in direct competition with British Airways on the London to Hong Kong route. In 1982, when Laker Airways collapsed in February, BCal absorbed Laker's Los Angeles and New York routes. It was growing, genuinely growing, turning into something that could conceivably become a real long-term competitor to BA. And precisely that is what made it dangerous. Here is something that most documentaries about BCal skip over entirely, and it matters enormously. In 1983, Adam Thompson made a proposal to the British government. A formal proposal. He argued that British Caledonian should be allocated a significant portion of British Airways' most profitable routes. The logic was sound. BCal was the designated second force, the competition the government itself had mandated. To make that competition real, it needed real routes, not the leftover routes BA didn't want. The good ones. The newly appointed chairman of British Airways, Lord King of Wartnabe, responded publicly. He called Thomson's proposal a smash-and-grab raid. Think about that language for a moment. An independent airline, doing exactly what the government's own policy said it should do, competing with the state carrier, and the state carrier's chairman calls it a criminal act. The Civil Aviation Authority actually partially endorsed Thomson's position in 1984. The regulator agreed that BCAL had a case. Route transfers were recommended. The government rejected them. The reason given largely was that any disruption to BA's profitability might damage the prospects for BA's privatization, a stock market flotation that was being prepared at the time. So the government protected its own financial interests over the competitive framework it had created. BCAL, the airline the government had specifically designed as BA's competitor, was denied the tools it needed to compete, because those tools might have reduced the value of the asset the government was about to sell. Nobody in power said that out loud, of course. But that is what happened. Now layer on top of that a sequence of external blows that BCAL had absolutely no control over. In 1982, the Falklands War ended BCAL's route to Buenos Aires overnight. Gone. A profitable, established long-haul route, wiped out by geopolitics. In 1986, the conflict involving Libya and the United States created such severe turbulence, in the commercial sense, that BCAL lost its Tripoli route entirely. Simultaneously, fear of terrorism across the North Atlantic suppressed passenger demand so dramatically that BCAL's transatlantic revenue collapsed. The swing in financial performance was brutal. A profit of £19.3 million in 1985 became a loss of £14.4 million the following year. In the same period, Nigeria's economic crisis destroyed the profitability of the Gatwick to Lagos service, one of BCAL's key African routes, the very routes the government had given them as a foundation back in 1970. And then in 1987, BCAL's helicopter service connecting Heathrow and Gatwick, a small but genuinely profitable operation, was shut down on environmental grounds. One by one, route by route, revenue stream by revenue stream, BC Hull was being bled out. Some of it by bad luck, some of it by the world, and some of it quietly and systematically, by a regulatory environment that was never truly designed to let them win. But the worst was still coming, and it arrived in a pinstriped suit. By early 1987, the numbers were undeniable. British Caledonian was in trouble. Real trouble. The accumulated weight of lost routes, suppressed passenger demand, and an inability to access Heathrow, where the real money in British aviation has always lived, had left the airline financially exposed in a way that no amount of operational efficiency could fix. Gatwick was BCAL's hub. That was always the problem nobody said loudly enough. Heathrow was, and remains, the premium airport. Business travelers, corporate contracts, the connecting passengers who spend more and complain less. BC Hull had tried, as early as the privatization discussions, to gain access to Heathrow's Terminal 4. Lord King rejected the approach with the same dismissive energy he'd used before. The door wasn't just closed, it was locked from the inside. Meanwhile, British Airways was transforming under King's leadership. He had taken over a bloated, demoralized state-run carrier in 1981 and spent 6 years turning it into something genuinely competitive. Staff numbers were cut dramatically. The culture was rebuilt. The brand, famously, was repositioned. By the time BA floated on the stock exchange in February of 1987, raising £900 million, it wasn't the BA of old. It was leaner, richer, and hungrier, and it had a list. On the 16th of July 1987, British Airways announced its intention to acquire British Caledonian. The offer, £237 million for all BCAL shares. The deal was immediately referred to the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, which sounds like protection, but in practice gave BA time to frame the narrative. SAVS, the Scandinavian airline system, entered with a counter-proposal, £110 million for 26% of BCAL, a partnership rather than an absorption. Adam Thompson was interested. A partnership with SAS would have kept BCAL alive as an independent entity, kept the brand, kept the culture, kept the competition. BA revised its offer upward. And then, in a move that says everything about how this game was played, BA reached a separate deal with the government, without informing BCAL. The Monopolies and Mergers Commission approved the merger on the condition that BCAL's competitive European routes out of Gatwick and its domestic trunk routes within the UK would be surrendered to smaller British carriers. Thomson was horrified. He'd spent nearly 2 decades building those routes, and now they were being handed away as a condition of his own company being sold, a sale he had not truly chosen, but had been cornered into by financial circumstances that were themselves partly the product of the regulatory environment that had always tilted against him. The shareholders voted. The money talked, as it always does. On the 14th of April 1988, at 1 second past midnight, British Caledonian Airways ceased to exist as a legal entity. 18 years. Built from a single leased aircraft. Grown into Britain's foremost independent international scheduled airline. Gone. And here is the detail that the history books mention quietly, if at all. 8 months later, the sky above Scotland was on fire. The 21st of December, 1988, 4 days before Christmas. The passengers who boarded Pan Am Flight 103 at Heathrow were, by most accounts, in good spirits. Many were heading home for the holidays. 35 of them were American students from Syracuse University, finishing a semester studying abroad in Europe and going back to their families. The Boeing 747, named Clipper Maid of the Seas, took off from Heathrow at 6:25 in the evening bound for New York's JFK. It was carrying 243 passengers and 16 crew. It had done this journey countless times. This was supposed to be routine. 38 minutes into the flight, at 7,300 meters above the Scottish border country, a bomb detonated in the forward cargo hold. The device had been concealed inside a cassette player, packed into a suitcase, and loaded at Frankfurt without an accompanying passenger. The explosion blew a hole in the fuselage. The aircraft broke apart in the sky. 259 people on board were killed instantly. The wreckage fell across 845 square miles of Scottish countryside. 11 residents of the town of Lockerbie died when the burning wings of the aircraft came down on Sherwood Crescent, turning a row of houses into a crater. Bodies were found in trees, in fields, some still strapped to their seats. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in the history of the United Kingdom. Until the 11th of September 2001. It was one of the most lethal acts of aviation terrorism anywhere in the world. Let's talk about what actually happened to British Caledonian after the merger. Because absorbed into British Airways sounds almost peaceful. It wasn't. When BA completed the acquisition in April of 1988, it inherited a substantial operation. 8 McDonnell Douglas the 600th, 10 aircraft, 5 Boeing 747s. 13 BAC 111-500, a future order for 10 Airbus A320 aircraft, notably the first Airbus jets BA would ever operate, because BCAL had been willing to look beyond Boeing, while BA had not. The aircraft were repainted in BA livery. The Boeing 747s were disposed of fairly quickly. The 111s followed. The DC-10s remained at Gatwick and continued operating into the late 1990s, long enough that passengers who knew their history could still see the ghost of BCAL in those aircraft. The same airframes, the same routes, just different paint. The Airbus A320s, BCAL's forward-thinking bet on European aviation, were transferred to Heathrow after delivery. Into the heart of the airport BCAL was never permitted to operate from. The routes BCAL had been forced to surrender as a condition of the merger. The competitive European routes out of Gatwick, the domestic trunk routes, were redistributed to smaller British carriers. In theory, this was meant to preserve competition. In practice, none of those smaller carriers had the scale to genuinely challenge BA. The routes were redistributed. Competition was not restored. It was theatre. BCAL had been required to give up 5,000 annual slot allocations at Gatwick. Slots are the lifeblood of an airport operation. Lose your slots and you lose your ability to build a coherent network. Those 5,000 slots, redistributed, didn't create a new competitor. They created a patchwork of smaller operations that posed no serious threat to the combined BA Gatwick dominance. And the name. What happened to the name is almost poetic in its brutality. British Airways already operated a charter subsidiary called British Air Tours. After the BCAL acquisition, it rebranded British Air Tours as Caledonian Airways. The lion on the tail was retained for a while. The tartan uniforms persisted in some form, just long enough to suggest continuity, just long enough to make it look like something had survived. Nothing had survived. Not really. The new Caledonian Airways operated as a BA subsidiary until 1995, when it was sold to the Carlson Group. It merged with Flying Colours Airlines in 2000 to form JMC Air. And then JMC Air was itself rebranded and eventually disappeared. The last trace of the name, the identity, the lineage, gone. Adam Thompson watched all of this. The man who had started with nothing, built Britain's second airline, fought the government, fought the regulator, fought Lord King, and lost, lived until 2000. He was 73 years old when he died. He never got the ending his story deserved. But his story isn't finished yet. Because what BCAL represented, what it was actually trying to do, matters more now than it did then. There's a question that sits at the center of all of this, and it's one that the official histories tend to sidestep. Was the death of British Caledonian inevitable? The standard answer, the one you'll find in most business analyses, is probably yes. BCAL was too small to compete with a privatized BA. It was caught between two worlds. Too large for the niche charter market, too small to sustain the broad international network a major carrier needs. The economics were always going to be difficult. That answer is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because what the standard analysis leaves out is the degree to which BCAL's size was itself a product of decisions made above it, decisions it had no control over. Start with Heathrow. BCAL was based at Gatwick from the beginning. That wasn't a free market choice. It was a regulatory allocation. And the dominant carrier at Heathrow was BA. BCAL's multiple attempts to gain meaningful access to Heathrow, and without Heathrow, BCAL could never capture the premium business travel market that generates the kind of revenue that funds long-haul expansion. Then there's the route structure. BCAL's international network was heavily concentrated in Africa, South America, and the Middle East markets the government had assigned to it because BA didn't prioritize them in the early years. These were volatile markets, dependent on political stability and commodity prices. When the Falklands War closed Buenos Aires, BCAL had no alternative long-haul route to absorb the loss. When Nigeria's economy collapsed, there was no backup. The diversification BCAL needed was precisely the kind of diversification that required Heathrow access and major European trunk routes, which were held by BA. BCAL tried to expand into Australia and Hong Kong in 1981. Both bids were blocked by opposition from Qantas and Cathay Pacific, incumbents who had their own reasons to keep the independent British carrier out. The regulatory framework that might have supported BCAL's case didn't. And then there was the 1983 route transfer proposal, the one Lord King called a smash-and-grab raid. The Civil Aviation Authority endorsed it, in part. The government rejected it to protect BA's privatization value. Think about what that means. The government created BCAL to be a competitor, then denied it the tools to compete, because doing so would have cost the government money. Let's go back to 1986 for a moment, because that year is when the trajectory became irreversible, and most people don't know exactly why. Two things happened simultaneously that year that hit BCAL like a double punch. The first was the American bombing of Libya in April of 1986, Operation El Dorado Canyon. The U.S. Air Force launched strikes against Tripoli and Benghazi in retaliation for a bombing in Berlin that had killed American servicemen. The British government under Margaret Thatcher allowed American F-111s to fly from bases in England. It was a controversial decision, and one of the immediate consequences for British aviation was a collapse in transatlantic passenger confidence. Fear of terrorist reprisals, specifically against aircraft flying from British airports, caused a significant drop in bookings across the North Atlantic. The second blow in 1986 was the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in April. The fallout, not just radioactive, but psychological, suppressed European travel demand across the spring and summer. Passengers cancelled holidays, tour operators lost bookings, charter operations suffered. Together, these two events erased approximately 25% of BCAL's revenue in a single year. That is not a figure from a business school simulation. That is the real swing that turned a £19.3 million profit in 1985 into a £14.4 million loss in 1986. 1 year. One swing of £33 million. In an airline that was already constrained in its ability to grow. And here is the brutal commercial reality of aviation. Airlines do not survive years like that without reserves. BC2 didn't have the reserves. It didn't have them because it had never been allowed to build the route network that would have generated them. And it hadn't been allowed to build that network because of the decisions we've already discussed. So when the losses hit, BCAL had to look for a merger partner. Not because Adam Thompson wanted to sell, because the financial position left no other realistic option. There are people watching this who flew on BCAL, who remember exactly what it felt like. You remember the check-in at Gatwick, not Heathrow, always Gatwick, which had its own character, its own pace, its own slightly different version of Britain. You remember the tartan, not as a gimmick, as something that felt specific, felt chosen, felt like someone had made a decision about who they were and what they stood for. The cabin crew on BCAL was something that people who flew with them still talk about. Not because they were perfect, because they were present, because the airline's entire culture communicated that you as a passenger had made a choice, and they intended to honor that. We never forget you have a choice. There's a particular kind of corporate death that is worse than a bankruptcy. A bankruptcy is visible. It has a moment. It has a headline. People mourn it in real time. What happened to BCAL was different. It was a slow erasure. The name persisted for a while on a charter subsidiary that BA used to keep the goodwill without honoring the spirit. The aircraft persisted, repainted. The routes persisted, under different ownership. Even the tartan persisted, for a season or two. But the thing itself, the independent spirit, the genuine alternative, the airline that had looked British Airways in the eye and said we're here and we intend to compete, that was gone. And it was gone in a way that was deliberately gradual, deliberately managed, so that nobody could point to a single moment and say, there. That is where it ended. Here is what the story of British Caledonian actually teaches us. Not about aviation, about Britain. About the gap between what this country says it believes, competition, independence, the right to challenge, the right to choose, and what it actually does when competition becomes inconvenient for the right people. BCAL was in the most literal sense a government project, created by government policy, supported by government route transfers, designated by a government report as the second force British aviation needed, and then dismantled, not by the market, not by passenger preference, not by a failure of service or safety, but by a sequence of regulatory decisions and political choices that consistently, at every key moment, prioritize the value of the state asset over the health of the competitive framework. That is not an obscure technicality. It is the central fact of BCAL's history. And it matters because this pattern, the creation of a nominal competitor, followed by the systematic denial of the tools that competitor needs, followed by the absorption of that competitor once it becomes financially weakened. This is not unique to aviation. It is not unique to the 1980s. Anyone who has watched British industry over the decades will recognize this shape. Adam Thompson built something real. He built it from a single leased aircraft in 1961 to Britain's foremost independent international scheduled airline. He fought for his passengers, for his routes, for his people. He watched governments make promises and break them. He watched a competitor use political access as a commercial weapon. And at the end of it, he shook the hand that had beaten him. Because what else do you do? And watched his life's work disappear into a machine that was larger, better connected, and ultimately more powerful than anything he could have built from Gatwick. 8 months later, a bomb fell on Scotland. On the Scotland whose name BCAL had carried across the world. And the airline that might have represented something, a Scottish-rooted, independent-spirited, genuinely competitive force in British aviation, wasn't there to bear witness. That absence means something. It's not dramatic metaphor. It's just the truth. If you flew with BCal, leave a comment below. Tell us the route. Tell us what you remember. The tartan, the DC-10, the check-in at Gatwick South Terminal, the feeling of choosing something other than the default. We want to hear it. These memories deserve to be spoken out loud. If this video has told you something you didn't know about BCal, about how British aviation really worked, about what we lose when independence loses to power, then like it and share it with someone who was there. Someone who will understand exactly why this story still stings. And subscribe to this channel. Because we are not done with British aviation history. Not by a long way. There are more airlines that deserve this kind of honesty. More stories where the official version and the real version are not the same thing. More names that should not be forgotten. BC Toll flew with a lion on its tail, and a slogan that dared you to choose. We choose to remember it properly.